lecture is going to be on necessary and sufficient conditions. So conditional statements, which are an important aspect of logic, and how we understand propositions and the truth of propositions. So when we're dealing with necessary and sufficient conditions, it's important to first understand basically just conditional statements. And conditional statements express a kind of hypothesis and conclusion within a proposition. So we're creating a complex proposition that has multiple parts. And these conditional statements typically are expressed in the form of if-then statements. So you can see a couple examples here. If I want to get an A in this class, then I had better study. The hypothesis being, if I get an A in the class, or I want to get an A in this class, and the conclusion being, I had better study. So we're assuming if the first part of this is true, then hopefully the second part will be true too. And we will go over this more in depth later on in the course. But for just conditional statements overall, we're using this kind of hypothesis conclusion process to really just express a complex proposition. We can also say, if I don't study for the test, then I will probably fail. Again, assuming that if you don't study, then you will fail. And so it's important that when we're understanding conditional statements or conditional propositions, that we're understanding the necessary and sufficient aspect of those propositions. So because there are two parts typically, the if part and the then part, we need to make sure we're understanding what is essentially the cause and effect of each part. What is the necessary and what is the sufficient piece? Because if we were to take an if-then statement and reverse the order of the hypothesis and conclusion part, the if-then part, then that proposition would be saying something completely different. And so we need to make sure that we're getting clear what part should be where, and when a conditional statement is expressed, which part is the hypothesis, which part is the conclusion. So what's necessary and what is sufficient. So what I'd like you to do is think of the answer to this question, assuming that if there is a letter on one side of the card, there is going to be a number on the other, and if there is a number on one side, there is going to be a letter on the other. Now, I don't know what's on the other side of these cards. However, I want to know what's the least amount of cards that need to be turned over and which cards they are in order to prove the following question true. If a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other. So in order to verify this statement, in order to determine whether or not this statement is true or false, which card or cards do we have to turn over in order to make sure we know that if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other? Before we get into the answer to that, it's important to go over necessary and sufficient conditions to really understand what that means. If I'm using the example of if this fruit is a lemon, then it is yellow, this if-then conditional statement expresses two things. It expresses a necessary and a sufficient condition. It tells you that being a lemon is sufficient for the thing being yellow, meaning if the thing is a lemon, then it is guaranteed to be yellow. When we use the word sufficient, we're saying it's all you need in order for the other thing to happen. So if this statement were true, then all I would need to do is tell you that something is a lemon, and then you would be able to deduce that it would have to be something yellow, right? So if I said, this thing in my hand that you cannot see is a lemon, you would know before I showed it to you that it was yellow based on the truth of this statement. So the lemon, or the fruit being a lemon, is sufficient for it being yellow. What this conditional statement also tells us, however, is that the yellowness, or the thing being yellow, is a necessary condition upon it being a lemon. which means that if it's a lemon, then it is guaranteed to be yellow, which means yellowness is a necessary component. The yellowness is always attached to the lemon. It can't not be attached to the lemon, assuming this phrase is true. So, when we're looking at if-then statements, the if part is sufficient for, or is all you need for, the then part. And the then part is a necessary piece and something that is always attached to the if part. And so looking at this proposition, if John is doing respiratory therapy at San Diego State University, then he has at least 2 A's. What this proposition is expressing is having 2 A's is a necessary condition upon doing respiratory therapy, which means if somebody tells me at San Diego State that they're in the respiratory therapy program, then I at least know baseline that they have at least 2 A's. That is guaranteed. What this isn't telling us, though, is that just because you have 2 A's, you are doing respiratory therapy. So while I may go up to someone who's doing respiratory therapy and know that they have 2 A's, I can't walk up to someone who has 2 A's and assume they're doing respiratory therapy. It doesn't work in the reverse order. And this is why it's important to understand what's necessary and what's sufficient based on what the proposition is saying. And so the truth of this propositional claim is dependent on these necessary and sufficient conditions and whether or not the if is in fact sufficient for the then and whether or not the then is in fact necessary for the if. Now looking at this proposition, if John gets 3 A's, he will get into UCSD to do philosophy. What we're saying here is that 3 A's is sufficient to get into UCSD to do philosophy. So, even if John doesn't take the SATs, is not a part of any program, and is terrible at sports, as long as he gets 3 A's, he'll get into UCSD to do philosophy. What this is also saying is even if John cheats on his SATs and beats up the president of the university's son and commits a crime, as long as he has 3 A's, he is guaranteed the spot to do philosophy at UCSD. The 3 A's are sufficient. That's all you need in order to get in. Now, you could get in to do philosophy at UCSD and not have 3 A's, right? Maybe you did get high test scores, or maybe you're really good at basketball. This isn't saying that the only way to get in to UCSD to do philosophy is to get 3 A's. It's just saying that if you have 3 A's, you're guaranteed a spot. You can also get a spot for many other reasons. Sufficient just means that's enough in order to warrant the conclusion aspect of the conditional statement. And so one complicated factor when it comes to dealing with conditional statements, and this is going to be something that's important with this module and just understanding propositions and conditional statements in general, is that they don't always have the words if or then in them. Sometimes the then portion comes before the if portion. Sometimes the then portion isn't there. Sometimes neither portion is there. And the sentence is just written out like a normal sentence without the use of these words. It's still important to understand that we might be expressing a complex proposition if there is a necessary and sufficient condition element within the statement. And so when we're looking at a propositional statement and a complex proposition, it could be the case that we're dealing with an if-then statement, necessary and sufficient condition, even if the words if and then aren't there. And so it's important that we're able to understand which part is necessary and which part is sufficient so that we can reorder or organize the statement so that it could have the words if and then in it. For instance, here's a table of different conditional statements written in different ways. Notice how some of them don't include the words if or then. If I were to look at the first statement, if I try, I will succeed. Typically, when you have a comma and you're using a conditional statement, there's an implicit then between the comma and the next word. And so, if I try, then I will succeed. This is equivalent to the symbol and abbreviation on the right of the screen, the arrow representing the if-then conditional. So if T were true, then S would be true. If I try, then I will succeed. The second one, I will try if I succeed, or I'm sorry, I will succeed if I try. You can see that it's written in the reverse order, but the if is in the middle of the sentence here. Even though the if is in the middle of the sentence, however, the piece that's attached to the if I try, is going to still be the sufficient part of the conditional statement. So if I try, then I will succeed is the same equivalent statement as I will succeed if I try. So the first and second statements are identical logically. They both express the same necessary and sufficient condition. The third sentence, again, is equivalent. I'll try only if I will succeed. Using the words only if actually do something to the proposition unlike if you were to just use the word if. If you use the words only if, then it actually will flip what is the necessary and sufficient piece. So typically, if we were to look at this third sentence and ask ourselves what is attached to the if portion and what is attached is I will succeed, because the word only precedes if, then even though the I will succeed is attached to the if, it actually is the consequent or is the necessary part of the statement. And it's important to just vocabulary to mention, if you're looking at the statements on the right or looking at the symbols on the right, what is on the left in the top, so T arrow S, the T is referred to as the antecedent, the thing that comes before. The thing after the arrow, the S, is referred to as the consequent. So the antecedent, T, is sufficient for the consequent S, and the consequent S is necessary for the antecedent T. So in that third sentence, I'll try only if I will succeed, the I will succeed is actually still going to be the consequent, the necessary piece, even though it's attached to the if. The fourth sentence, now, you see that there is no word if in there or then. I will succeed unless I don't try. This sentence, even though it's not expressing the words, not using the words if or then, it is still expressing a conditional statement. This conditional statement, when reworded or reorganized, would look like the symbol on the right. So I will succeed unless I don't try. That little line in front of the S is essentially just a not, right? So I will not succeed. So if I were to use the word unless in a sentence, I will succeed unless I don't try, that unless will actually flip the conditions and negate the antecedent aspect. So if essentially what I'm saying here, I will succeed unless I don't try, is that if I don't succeed, it means I didn't try. The fourth sentence again, is one that doesn't have the words if and then, but instead has the words on condition. I will try on condition that I succeed. So again, it's saying I will try on condition, and on condition is saying assuming that something else happens. And if we're saying that something else is going to happen, then it becomes the sufficient part, right? It becomes the cause. And then the other piece becomes the effect or the conclusion to that hypothesis. So I will try on condition that I succeed would be written that if I succeed, then I will have tried. Next, my success implies that I tried. In an if-then statement, we would write this as if I succeed, then I will have tried. And there are many different ways. These are only a few of the different ways in which we can understand conditional statements and the necessary and sufficient components. Because English is such a difficult language, a complicated language, there are many ways in order to express necessary and sufficient conditions. And so here's another example, right? When we're looking at a sentence, it's important to work out what is the necessary and what is the sufficient component. So if I were to give you the sentence, you've got to work hard in order to succeed, I might ask, is working hard a necessary or sufficient condition of succeeding? And here, working hard is a necessary condition upon succeeding. And the reason we would know that is because the sentence reads, you have got to work hard. And if you have to do something, if it has to be a component, it's a mandatory component, then it is necessary. So working hard is a necessary part to success, which means if we were to write this in an if-then statement, it would be, if you succeed, then you have got to work hard. And so with this sentence, ask yourself, what is the necessary and sufficient component? Is having a garden a necessary or sufficient condition of being happy in life? Assuming the sentence reads, to be happy, all you need is a garden. Here, having a garden is sufficient to being happy because it's all you need. There are no other parts. As long as you have the garden, you will be happy. So I can get in a car accident, right? Walk home, find that my house is burnt down, but because I have a garden in the back, life is great. That's what this sentence is expressing. It's expressing that gardening or having a garden is sufficient. It is all you need to be happy. So now looking back at this card test, now that we know a little bit more about conditional statements and the necessary and sufficient components, ask yourself, what is the minimum number of cards or card that I need to turn over, and which card or cards is it, in order to verify that if a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other. If you answered A and 7, you are correct. Now the reason that it's A and 7 is because, remember, the statement is saying if a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other. So we would flip the A because it is a vowel, and we want to know that there is an even number on the back. Because remember, having a vowel is sufficient for an even number. So if there's not an even number, then this statement is false. When we look at D, we don't need to flip this card over because the statement is saying if a card has a vowel on one side, it has said nothing about consonants. And so we don't care about flipping over the D. The reason we don't flip over the 4 is because this condition will be met regardless of what's on the back of this card. So if a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other. So if what's on the back of the 4 is the letter E, a vowel, then it meets the condition. If what's on the back is another consonant, T, then it doesn't matter, remember, because we don't care about consonants. We would, however, need to flip over the 7 to make sure that there is not a vowel on the back. Because remember, a vowel is sufficient for an even number. So if we don't have an even number, we can't have a vowel.